Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin, and we have Mr. Romano, who's the head of the Republican Party in Connecticut that has some interesting insights into various things. One of them in particular is maybe voting irregularities, and I'm sure he'll be well-versed in other areas as well. So welcome to Carnivore Radio. Mr. Romano, are you there? Dr. Lopkin.
He's not sure why he's not answering, but according to our system, he's on.
Okay. Well,
can you hear him?
I'm here.
Oh, there he goes.
Okay.
I'm here.
Awesome. So welcome to Carnivore Radio, and you've been a guest on our show before. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a lot to talk about, and our first question is going to be from Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about a tweet I saw from you saying that you had come across irregularities where dead people are voting in Connecticut. Can you tell us what you found and what's going on?
So basically what we found was someone who had passed away in 2012, according to the Secretary of State's records, had actually voted in person in 2018. Now, we know that in all likelihood that's a clerical error, right? No one came into the voting booth and pretended to be this person. But why we highlighted this was to show how egregious the voter rolls are and how weak the Connecticut voting system is. For example, one of the things that the Secretary of State wants to do, as well as many Democrats, is mail-in balloting. They want to do the mail-in voting. Mm-hmm. And in states that do mail-in voting, their Secretary of State and their other government agencies work together and they verify signature. They have all this software and technology securing the ballot. Connecticut doesn't have any of that. In fact, we have some of the worst voter rolls in the country. I think, for example, in Middlesex County, 115% of the population is registered to vote. So when you want to compare apples to apples, Connecticut doesn't have the infrastructure to secure the ballot the way that some of these other mail-in states do. And that's a part of a conversation and equation that Democrats don't want to talk about.
Why don't you think they want to talk about it?
Well, I think they're in a rush to get it done, one. But two is they don't want to clean their voter rolls. They don't, I was on a call with a gentleman by the name of Tom Swan, and he admitted, he literally said, voter fraud happens, but it only happens in the Democrat primary. Because it does happen, right? We know that it happened in Bridgeport. And my favorite is, and I'm going to try to get on a show out in Eastern Connecticut where they have a columnist out there that wrote how voter fraud doesn't happen. It happened in Bridgeport in 2019. And everyone is like, but the judge dismissed the case, which is true, because all they could do was prove that 35 votes were fraud, not enough to overturn the results of the election. But It doesn't mean it didn't happen. And so one of the things – go ahead.
Go ahead. A question that I think our listeners and I would like to know, can you cite any elections, recent elections, obviously, where you think this might have come into play?
Well, I have honestly, I can't think of a specific example, right? Because here's what I do know. The reason that I'm putting up as much as a fight against every vote being secure, because Democrats will admit that, it happens, but it's not rampant, right? It's not a big deal. And to which one of the other tweets that I put out was, so in Connecticut, violent crime impacts 0.02% of our population. That would mean that it's not rampant. Does that mean we don't bother dealing with violent crime? Of course not. We take every measure for the safety and security of the people of the state. And the same goes for our votes. Just because it doesn't happen in a grand scale doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to prevent it from happening at all. In Connecticut, for example, in 2018, we had 8 recounts. We had 20. I think it was around 25 races that were decided by 1 percentage point. So we're talking race, in some cases, 10 votes. So when we have, and this is what it boils down to, when we have all of these weaknesses within our infrastructure, it calls into question the integrity of the elections. And that's the problem, is that when we can poke all these holes, and we're not alone. Marilyn Moore out in Bridgeport, there's many Democrats that are now coming forward about how this operation works. And, of course, the Democrats want to pretend it's not real.
Interesting.
Yeah,
go ahead.
For many years, I was a political consultant in New York City. And every year, we spent 2 to 3 days in court trying to get dead people who signed for a candidate to get those records removed. It happens every year.
Well, what's interesting is in New Haven, when they did the recanvassing, which is required by law, something like 10,000 addresses came back undeliverable. So like 10,000 essential voters came back undeliverable. So saying basically these people are not here. I think it's either 10,000 or 20,000, but it was a lot. And 90 voters were removed. So what happens is you can't prove voter fraud if someone steals a vote from someone that didn't know it was stolen. Right? So for example, if someone broke into my house and decided to rob me and they stole something out of my basement, but I didn't know it was stolen, did the robbery happen? And that's kind of one of the big issues with mail-in voter fraud, where if you're an inactive voter or someone that moved, you have no idea if someone stole your vote. And that's the big part of difficulty in proving absentee ballot fraud.
So as head of the Republican Party in Connecticut, obviously you think this does have an impact on who we elect, or you wouldn't be involved in it, correct?
But I don't look at it that way. I think voting is literally the most important thing we do as a republic. And whether it impacts the election or not, it doesn't matter. A vote should be I believe in as much access as possible, but I also believe in as much security as possible. Because what happens if someone does? What happens if someone's vote? And this is what happened in Bridgeport. That it's discovered that their vote's stolen, and now they lose that right. They can't vote twice, right? They can't go in and say, hey, why is my name checked off on an absentee ballot? I'm here to vote. I didn't vote by absentee. Well, it says that you did. Now what? And so those are the types of things that why I say it's, whether it impacts an election or not, I think is irrelevant. I think it's about the integrity of the most important part of our rights and preserving the republic.
Since your tweet, has anything happened in terms of maybe the press latching on to this or investigating or reporting on it?
No, the Hearst media did a somewhat of a kind of like what I would describe as a justifiable, we made a mistake kind of thing. Like it was a soft story. It wasn't hard hitting. And no one else picked it up, which is disturbing. This is what's happening in our. They always talk about the press being the fourth estate, right? That entity that's supposed to hold our elected officials accountable. I can honestly tell you that they're not in this state, and they're not doing it on the national level. In a 1 week period, you had this. We discovered the dead voters, not the Secretary of State, not the media. We did. And the media didn't cover it in the middle of this. Because here's the beauty. Under the system that Denise Merrill wants, this dead voter would have received an absentee ballot application because he would have moved from an inactive voter to an active voter based on the state system. How crazy is that?
Huh.
Because they made a clerical error. Whoever lives at his address now would receive a ballot in his name because he'd been moved to an active voter even though he had died in 2012.
Wow.
But no one...
Dr. Lopkin,
Go ahead, sorry.
Dr. Lopkin, any comments, questions on that?
Well, I mean, what's going on with voter fraud in this state is absolutely horrific, and the media is complicit. We had a situation here in Middletown where an elected official, it was found that both of his sons voted for him. The problem with this is that neither one of his sons has lived in Connecticut for the past 10 years. Middletown press covered it. And then all of a sudden, the story was gone. You couldn't find it in the archives. You couldn't find it online. Nothing. They've scrubbed it from the site.
Well, doesn't he go into Mr. Romano's assertion that it used to be the press was kind of the third estate, if you will, and Mr. Romano, you comment on that. That's gone, correct? A fourth estate, I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh, it's
gone.
Completely gone. The press is part of the political process, but not as an entity to safeguard the process. They've decided who they want to back, and they're doing their best to make sure their candidates get elected. They're no more objective media. They're lobbyists.
Mr. Romano, when do you think, assuming that what Dr. Lopkin is saying is true, which I do believe, what period of time do you think that changed? Because I think there has been a change.
But I think, I'm going to say in the last decade it's gotten really, really bad. I think there's always been somewhat of a liberal bias, but I think that there was always a sense of integrity that the reporters tried to uphold. That's just gone. I've had conversations when I talked about the Joe Biden comments, "You ain't black." No one did a story. No, not a single Connecticut reporter did a story on those Joe Biden comments. And when you think of when Trump was running in 2016, every tweet, every comment, I had a reporter in my face asking me to make a comment about his comments. And I think that the sad part about it, there's a disservice to so many people because I can't think of a more egregious and racist comment that a presidential candidate has made in modern history. To strip someone of their racial identity because they don't agree with the Democrat Party is beyond the pale as far as I'm concerned. And the best part about it is the Democrats are like, he said he was sorry. Okay. So maybe Joe Biden...
To me, I think it's very troubling. I'm just wondering, what do you think of the root of this is? I agree with it that it's happening and that it has happened. What's the basis for it? I mean, how do you think even Walter Cronkite might have been liberal at heart or liberal inclinations, but he did do a relatively decent job in presenting both sides. That's pretty much gone. In the last 8 years, when you had the Obama 8 years, and then particularly here in the state of Connecticut, Democrats have been in control of the legislature for 40 years. What happens is from a policy standpoint, their policies, as we know, for me personally, are failures, right? They don't do a good job in terms of economic recovery. They don't manage budget well. Their programs don't work. And so they can't own that failure, right? So think of it like the way that reporters operate. It'd be like a diehard Boston Red Sox fan being the reporter that has to cover the Yankees. They're never going to write a story that says the Yankees are great. And so because they're tied to this political ideology and this party that's failing, they can't write that story, right? They can't present their ideas as being failures and things that they believed in. And so, for example, like the Hartford editorial board that supported an idea from 10 years ago now is turned into an absolute disaster. They're not going to go back and say, we're sorry. They're going to double down. And so what happens is Republicans are blamed for – I mean, it's amazing to me when people – and someone just tweeted at me about this.
at how they blame John Rowland and Jody Rell are responsible for Connecticut's fiscal crisis. But they won't. They seem to forget that the Democrats have controlled our legislature for 40-something years. And Jody Rell vetoed budgets that they passed only to – they had so many Democrats that the veto was overridden. And so, this is where the press isn't going to remind people of that because they love to go after John Rowland, right? He's their villain, which I get it, corruption and all that other stuff. But, this is what is happening where and by the way, that's one of the reasons why the left and Democrats have turned into a party that just makes personal accusations about whether it's racism, white supremacy, sexism, because they can't stand up and say, my policies failed. What they say is you have to stick with me being in power because everyone else that's not me is a racist or a sexist. And by the way, that goes for people of color that don't agree with that.
All right, hold that thought for a moment because we've got to take a break and go to commercial. We'll be right back.
Why was the basketball court all wet? Because the players kept dribbling on it.
The dad joke. Corny, grown-worthy, but also one of the simplest ways to share a moment with your kids.
What did the buffalo say when he dropped his son off for school? Bye, son.
So take a moment to make your kid laugh, because dad jokes rule. Make your kid laugh today. Go to fatherhood.gov. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
And we're back. And if you'd like to be part of the conversation, you can call us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693.
So let's talk a little bit about the state of the Republican Party, both, let's just look at Connecticut first and nationally. Let's look at the bright side first, Mr. Romano. Anything you'd like to share, any points you'd like to share with our listening audience in terms of bright spots, the spots where you see?
Well, anyone that's listening who happens to be a Republican and feels distraught from 2018, many Democrats beat their chest and said, blue wave, right? I want everyone to understand the Democratic Party outspent us by $30 million. And that does not include the help they get from unions, right, where people go door to door and all this other stuff. Ned Lamont and Chris Murphy, when you combine their money, outspent us by $30 million. And they barely beat us.
Even Chris Murphy barely beat you?
Well, no, I'm talking about in terms of the governor's race, and I'm talking about
just overall. Okay, I got you. Yes.
Overall. So I ran everyone has a short memory. I ran in 2004 and 2006. Those were blue waves. We went down to 38 members of the General Assembly. 38. Now, I'm not saying we had a great year by any means, but we lost 12 seats in the General Assembly, and most of which were within 100 votes. And we were outspent by $30 million. So anyone listening to this, did you work as hard as you possibly could in 2018? Did you knock a door for a candidate? Did you give money to a candidate? Did you volunteer to do work with us? If you're upset at what's happening in the state, a little bit more manpower and a little bit more time, and we can honestly make gains like we did in 2016 this year. But we can't sit back and say it's a blue state. What are we going to do? We're outnumbered. So we need everyone to participate.
Mr. Romano, don't you think it's somewhat counterintuitive? Because you look at the state of the state, someone who grew up here, me, and the state has fallen greatly in terms of opportunities. I mean, you can have a whole list. We won't go into it. What is it? What's the infatuation with the Democrats in this state? I mean, has it served us well? I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive, I guess is my point.
Well, I think Republicans do a very bad job of explaining how we care about someone's family. And so take Bob Stefanowski. I love Bob. I think he's a tremendous human being. He's got a kind soul. He's a good man. when Bob talks about eliminating the income tax, of course, Democrats can put out the Green New Deal and all these crazy proposals, and no one asks them, how are you going to pay for it, right? But they're talking about, nationwide veganism. No one says a word. Bob talks about eliminating the income tax, and of course, everyone says, you're never going to do it. It's 50% of our budget. All this, and this is what, of course, the media, this is what they keep saying. But what Bob should have done, and I had conversations with his team, and they didn't listen to me. If Bob stood up and said, the reason I want to eliminate the income tax is not just that it'll help our economy here in the state of Connecticut, which has been crushed by it, but because a single mom in Middletown, Connecticut, who's working as a dental hygienist making $55,000 a year, if I'm putting $100 or $200 more a week in her pocket, then that's our obligation as political leaders. We can no longer look at those single moms and say, we're going to raise your taxes because we can't figure this out. We owe it to them to put money back in their pocket. And so by
sounds like a good point. Why wasn't that done? Humanize the situation.
So this is where Republicans in general don't express themselves in that kind of, because at the end of the day, what we believe, we know economically we're right. Right? Lowering taxes will increase the economy. It will grow the grand list, which means you broaden the tax base, which means actually more tax collection to help. So, but we just always talks about it in the context of the economy versus family. And one of the things, like even the toll fight, when we started talking about and we were fortunate because there wasn't a candidate, it was just messaging that we could talk about. How can you justify to that same single mom that lives in Middletown and they work in Hartford that she's got to come up with $1,000 a year just to drive to work? Never mind, going to your grandparents or whatever else it may be. Just to drive to work, the state of Connecticut's like, hey, we need $1,000 more a year from you. You can't justify it. You can't. And so
Dr. Lopkin?
That's how we have.
Good. Dr. Lopkin?
So, obviously politics haven't really taken center stage with everything going on, but we do have local elections coming up. What are the issues that the Connecticut Republican Party wants to get out there?
Well, I think first and foremost is with the pandemic. We all recognize that this is going to have a deep impact on economic output. It's going to have an impact on state revenues. You have to ask yourself if you're a voter, and these are the things that we're going to talk about. We should be electing people that are going to focus on holding the line on spending and not looking at our residents as revenue sources. Because the Connecticut budget is going to have massive shortfalls. And if you elect Democrats, I can guarantee you they're going to raise your taxes to fill those holes. They're not going to cut anything. And Ned Lamont, unlike Dan Malloy, I think is a genuinely nice guy. I just think he's bad at his job. He lacks the courage to stand up to the unions and renegotiate some of these things. He lacks the courage to take on some of the special interests that are demanding more from the state of Connecticut. He lacks the courage to push back on the progressives that have taken over the Democratic Party, where they've chased out moderate Democrats. And there's going to be a run on basically it's just going to get worse from here if we continue to elect Democrats. So everyone listening to this, let's not forget that of course he's going to side with the progressive Democrats because he tried to push Joe Lieberman out of the party for being too moderate. Well, but I think that was a war thing, right? Ned was against the war. He was a war hawk. I mean, I don't think it was a tax issue, but I think now, we're a decade later, progressives are completely out of their mind, right? You're watching what's happening in Seattle. I mean, this is a progressive utopia, and it's an utter disaster. So, and I don't think Ned knows how to balance this or has the ability to stand up. I mean, look. He grew up a privileged, rich white guy. He was the son of a trust fund, right? So, he just doesn't have the ability to say no to some of these people, and it's going to get worse for the state of Connecticut unless Republicans get more numbers in the General Assembly like we did in 2018, because they're going to what they'll do is they'll turn to the residents of the state and say, you got to pay us more. And I don't think many people. I don't know how much more people can afford.
That is true. So you're saying is what's happening nationally is also happening in Connecticut in terms of the Democratic Party moving so much to the hard left. That's actually happening in our very own state.
I mean, what was funny was there's a great moment in the legislative session when they were talking about the Republicans introduced a bill to track welfare spending, people who are getting food stamps or cash subsidies, and it was something that was passed in Massachusetts. So it's not like this was like this hard right, we're stripping people of like benefits. But it was a tracking system that the Democrats in Massachusetts had adopted, and literally, it's basically you shouldn't be if you're using your food stamp card on a cruise or at Disneyland, it should be revoked, right? And so it was something along those lines, and they were debating it, and this Democrat stood up and said, "That's a violation of freedom of speech. We should not be tracking how they're spending the money." But meanwhile, the state of Connecticut and the federal government will track every dime and dollar that I earn because they got to get their cut.
Yep.
But when you ask for someone who's getting a government benefit, like you really shouldn't be going. And it's actually quite sad when you look at the number of transactions that are at strip clubs, that are at cruises, that are in Vegas, that are in Disney. And it shows an abuse of people who can't afford to go on those vacations, but yet, they're considered middle class and paying into the system. And there was Democrats that, by the way, this didn't pass. Progressives killed it.
Wow. Interesting. So where do you see the state of the state in terms of politically and also as as an entity? I mean, it once was the great state of Connecticut. When you wanted a job, anyone could have. I grew up here. It was an amazing state. It's really kind of not the case anymore, is it?
I still think there's a lot of benefit to where we are. I think it's been mismanaged. I think if you actually look at like Republican leaders across the state, Mark Boutman, Aaron Stewart, any one of our municipal leaders, they know how to manage. They know how to get this done. And so even when you consider, I love the fact that so many Democrats are talking about how we have this rainy day fund. The state was set up in a very good position because the Republicans pushed a bipartisan budget in 2000. Remember, we made all those gains in 2016? So it was actually the Republican budget that got passed that has allowed us to somewhat weather this pandemic and have a nice rainy day fund. But that's the only reason why, because the Republicans' budget is the one that passed. So, it's one of those things where I think if you really want to see this state right the ship, a lot of tough decisions have to be made. So you're going to see the press. You're going to see unions complain. You're going to see all these people say, what about us? This state is only going to get worse if we continue to go down this path because we never recovered jobs. We only were about, I think it was 86% capacity of the jobs we lost in 2009. And after this pandemic, how are we going to have to wait another decade before we get back to, so it'll be 20 years?
We can't afford to do that.
It'll be 20 years before we get back to 2009 numbers.
And we've got to stop with that thought. Thank you so much for coming on. You can catch Carnivore Radio every Friday at 4 on blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. You can catch the replay as well as Carnivore Bites on demand on the Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find your podcasts. Mr. Romano, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you so much.